I want to welcome everyone to this morning's webinar. I apologize for getting started a few minutes late. Had some technical issues with the software, but I think we've got everything ironed out and look like we're about ready to get started. Great. So yeah, I think we have a really exciting topic and some really excellent speakers from kind of a wide range of different pursuits, from policy, business, and kind of the legal community as well, to kind of take an analysis and overview of the European Union emission trading system and kind of the lessons there are for California. So since we do have a pretty large agenda and a couple really great presentations to go through, I'm going to limit my remarks just to welcoming each of our speakers. To start us off, we have Simone Ruiz, who's the EU Policy Director at the International Emissions Trading Association. And she's going to kind of give us an overview, and then we'll be followed by kind of a private sector experience from Jeffrey Hopkins at Rio Tinto, who's going to talk about their experience with facilities in a variety of different climate policies and emissions trading schemes. And then we'll have Alex Hanafi and Derek Walker from the Environmental Defense Fund talk about the results of the EU ETS and the lessons that it has for California. So with that, Simone, I'm going to kick it off to you, and we will get started. So thank you very much. Simone, you there?
Thank you, Scott. I hear myself with a big echo.
Yeah, can you mute your line, and I'll mute mine as well. I think that might fix it.
Okay, I'll try again. Still an echo. Is it better now? Okay.
Yeah, that's better.
Perfect. So, yes, thank you very much for inviting me. Just to say that IETA represents 150 corporate members from industrial side to the financial side, and we have been active in Brussels since 5 or so years, looking at the EU ETS and following up on the regulatory process, commenting on inefficiencies, and working together with different institutional actors here in Brussels to improve the functioning of the scheme over time. So let me just start with the 5 key principles that I think the EU ETS has been built on. The first one was really to keep it open, and that is well enshrined as well into the legal framework. Anybody can participate in that scheme. The second is to keep it cheap, because it's the idea of having a cost-effective mechanism to reduce emissions. The third is to keep it local, and that was especially initially a very strong condition for member states to buy into that system, and to keep it fair so that companies are on a level playing field. And fifth, to keep it predictable, because industry needs a predictable system to be able to do long-term investments. And so the question arises whether the European carbon market is a sort of a holy grail that could be copied in California. So let me just go a bit deeper into the different principles. Keep it open. As you can see, a real rationale for any functioning market is liquidity, which is key for efficient price formation. On the slide, you can see the total transaction value in the EU ETS has increased tremendously over since inception. Every year it has increased, and I think even in recession times it is a small increase that you can see in the value of overall transactions. It is also enshrined in ETS law. Everybody has to be able to participate. Sorry, I'm not yet. Thank you. Everybody can participate. There are no restrictions on bidding at the auctions, and there are no particular security requirements for the registry accounts. So everybody can be opening this account, and that was the initial setup. There was also no license requirements for anyone trading spot. If you were trading in the future market, so with future date delivery, then you were required to hold a license unless you were exempted from the financial framework. And there was no real targeted market oversight. Only in a very few member states did the regulators have an interest for the carbon market and look at it a little bit more closely. This worked pretty well until the market matured, and there was an interest from some criminals to be making a bit of money in this market, and we had some cybercrime. Allowances were stolen from registry accounts due to the very low security that these registries had implemented, and we had some VAT fraud. That was very specific to the EU ETS, but we can come back to that. There has been a radical review of the registry since then. The registry security has been upscaled, and we have now very special provisions for participating in EU auctions. Only operators and financial entities can participate, and if you are none of the two first categories, you have to be specially accredited. There is also an extension of financial oversight to the spot market. This is legislation that is in the making and will be finalized next year. So there was a certain reaction to these mishaps that happened midway through the scheme's implementation so far. And the second principle, to keep it cheap, is essentially in the beginning was essential to get industry support, really. We have the share of auctions was very low. It was mainly free allocation to industry on the basis of historic emissions. That led to problems because historic emissions have in the beginning not been measured with the same precision as later on, so there was a certain amount of over-allocation on the basis of this grandfathering, and the access to international offsets was also introduced as a cost containment mechanism. Up to 50% of the reduction effort could be used from offsets. And there was a provision to prevent any excessive price rises. However, no one thought of preventing excessive price reductions, and that's actually the situation we're in right now. So industry came on board, and really I think there is now vested interest in the scheme, this broad preference for trading over taxes. However, the allegations and of windfall profits and the oversupply in the scheme made very bad press. And currently, as the scheme goes into the next phase, starting next year, a few of these issues are directly fixed. We will move to full auctioning for the power sector. Only 10% of the most carbon-efficient industry will get free allocation. The others will have to purchase additional allowances, and there is no extension of the offset limit possible up to after 2020. So, there is no extension of the offset limit. So the use of it is still possible up to 2020, and after that we will see later on how the rules are being set for the next phase 4 then. Yeah. Then there is another requirement, which was to keep it local. As you can see from that little map, we do have quite a number of member states in the EU, and on top of it, Norway and Iceland participate in the scheme. So we do have a real strong incentive here to get every government on board. Those that produce, that rely on coal, in Poland, for instance, 95% of the energy production comes from coal, so it's quite coal intensive. Other countries have very high shares of renewables, and so you had in the very beginning a great effort to accommodate all these different member states, and so we had different ways of measuring, different ways of allocation, different ways of running a registry. However, one important factor is we had a very clear answer to no compliance. If you don't comply with the scheme, you have a fine of €100 per ton, and you still have to surrender the missing allowance for this ton emitted. So the very strict answer to non-compliance made that the compliance rate is very high, with over 99%. So it's a very good compliance rate. However, as the market grew, this very strong differentiation in the approach in different member states has become a problem, and coordination became more important. So we now have common rules for monitoring and reporting, for accreditation of third-party verifiers, and for the verification process. We have common benchmarks for the free allocation. We have common registry security, as I mentioned earlier. We have one single auction platform that is used by all the member states, but 3 exceptions, Germany, the UK, and Poland. But even for these 3 auction platforms, you have rules that are fully aligned with the EU-wide auction rules so that there can be no overlap in bidding windows. Okay. Then we move to the principle 4, to keep it fair, which is really essential if you have, if you add a price to carbon, that you keep the level playing field for industry. And that, of course, applies within the EU, between the different industries and across member states, but also outside with a view to international competition. So you have carbon leakage provisions, 100% up to the benchmark in each sector is allocated for free to certain industry that is exposed to carbon leakage. The problem here initially was that this list is very, very broad, covering up to 75% of manufacturing emissions. So you could say that those that are not on the list that did something wrong, really, because it's so broad. We also introduced state aid rules to make sure that if you give state aid to a certain sector, that the sector will have to do something for the state aid received. So that is for the compensation of indirect costs for electricity price rises. And then 10% of the allowances that were auctioned are redistributed for solidarity and growth. And that is also a mechanism to ensure that those member states that are a bit slower in economic development or that are not yet as developed as the others can be brought on board, and the industry in these countries will be able to receive special support. We are in a bit of an uncertain environment now because these carbon leakage provisions that they come to an end in 2020. That is tomorrow for industry, because investments are taken today for and will be there for the next 10, 15 years. So this affects the investment horizon. And state aid is basically only a realistic scenario for the very wealthy countries, maybe Germany, maybe Norway. Now, this is not yet really discussed. It's probably one of those things where you can see problems arising, but it could involve, for instance, the consideration of border tax adjustments in the future, and that, of course, will create, I think, an international reaction in some sense, and it will probably be a prominent feature of the next reform of the scheme, which we expect for 2015. Then Principle 5, keep it predictable. Industry wants to know where the ship is going. So they want to have the carbon price reflected in investment plannings. And for that, you need to know which the rules are, how you have to adjust to them, what the price horizon could be. In Europe, we have seen quite a number of carbon market analysts coming up with very sophisticated models to predict the carbon price. Obviously, with such an important recession as we have seen, all the predictions could be, or most of them could be thrown into the dustbin, but nevertheless we have built up a quite amazing capacity of forecast, which I think in normal economic times will do their job. We also have seen an increasingly long compliance phase, and that's probably quite a difference to the Californian scheme. We moved from 3 years in the pilot phase to 8 years in the next phase. We have no sunset clause in the cap reduction trajectory. It continues after 2020 without an end to it. Every year, 38,000 tons are being removed from the cap until it's being revised. Now, the only thing is that the revision of the rule framework is very cumbersome. So you can't just change the cap. You have to change the entire rule framework, and that's very specific to EU legislation. So you can't do a targeted change. And now, as a result of the recession, we really have to rethink. Supply rigidity has been a key factor for massive oversupply, and as a result, the low carbon price that we see today, which is a reaction to much lower demand than what we had initially expected. So the price reacted to new market conditions. It did its job, but it's now quite low, and we have this overhang of allowances, which will keep the price down for some time to come. So we have seen the Commission come out with a proposal on backloading. If you haven't heard that word before, this is basically a removal of or a lowering in the amount of volume to be auctioned in the couple of years to come. And then later on in phase 3, towards 2020, these allowances would be put back to the market. And that is a way to overcome the problem that we can't change the cap in the short term, but we will probably change it midterm, and then these allowances will never really have to be put back into the market. And we have a short-term response to the oversupply. So we will see a report at the same time on the functioning of the carbon market, which will propose more longer-term structural reforms, but really reforms that would affect the structure of the cap can only be possible in 2015-16. So it takes about 5 years for a system reform to take place, which I think is too long. So let me just conclude the lessons for California. Based on these key principles, I think it's important to keep it open, because especially in a small system, you will need liquidity. You will need to find a counterparty that buys your allowance, that purchases your allowance from you if you want to sell it, because you have done emission reductions and you can sell your allowances. And vice versa, if you are actually desperate to find an allowance, you will need to find someone who sells you the allowance. Without that, you can't have a price signal. There will be no price on carbon, and you have a very difficult market situation. So you will need to have these intermediaries in the market that play that role of taking allowances from some that don't need it and bring it to the market and sell it on. You also need to keep it cheap. That's important from a competitiveness point of view, especially given that California is, of course, not on its own, and you have cross-border issues directly, probably more than we do have in the EU. Also, another thing is, rather than keeping it very local and doing very specific exemptions for specific industries or specific countries in our case, it's very important to keep it centralized, to have clear rules, especially when it comes to the security, oversight, registry, operation, and auctions. Then also the fairness of the scheme is another point. The level playing field needs to be there. I think there's nothing new here. What is probably true as well is that when it comes to auctioning as a way of allocation, this is probably one of the most efficient system, but it is not necessarily fair if you have an industry that is maybe struggling for survival. But that is an issue that I think needs to be is very different from different regional perspectives and regional contexts. It's also important to keep it predictable no matter what the scheme is. When I look at the Californian cap legislation, I find it rather on the complicated edge, which would mean that a company that is operating the scheme might have it more difficult than a European company in analyzing the future of the scheme and in seeing where the trajectory is going and how potentially the supply-demand balance is developing over time. That is, of course, because you have a better flexibility in the scheme, which is, again, possibly an advantage in times when the economic situation changes quite dramatically. And finally, simplicity is probably key. We have problems explaining the system in Europe to normal citizens. I guess with the Californian system being even more sophisticated, more elaborated, that could be even of a more difficult problem. So what I think is important is that one trusts the market to discover cost-efficient reduction options, and that doesn't necessarily mean that the regulator has to come up with all the solutions for all the problems, but that it can be the market, it can be up to the market to come forward with certain products, with certain trading instruments that allow, for instance, industrials to hedge against increases in the price, to cover the price increase risk in advance, and I think that this is something that maybe California can learn from the EU in terms of how it has actually functioned quite well. Thank you very much. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Simone. That was really interesting. And I think we're just going to keep trucking right along since we started a little bit late. So Jeff, if you're on the line, I will go ahead and move to your presentation. Jeff Hopkins is the Principal Advisor for International Energy and Climate Policy at Rio Tinto, and he's going to talk about how they kind of balance priorities and handle staying competitive in a variety of different carbon regimes.
Thank you, Scott. And I should let you know that I'm not online. I have the presentation in front of me, but I think you'll be able to keep up.
I'll do my best.
Yeah, without much of a problem. So I appreciate that the Climate Action Reserve has put together this group kind of in keeping with Simone's last principle for California of keeping it simple. I would even extend it further in terms of objectives. There are a lot of regulated entities that have never had to deal with CO2 compliance issues before. So I think it's really imperative that forums such as this are used to try to increase familiarity and understanding of the programs, and comparing them with the EU may not make them appear any more simple, but I think it's really important to continue to work on education and outreach. As it turns out, Rio Tinto has probably operations in most areas where market-based carbon policies are in place, so or where they're being considered. So we do have a lot of experience in addressing compliance opportunities. We certainly have engaged quite a bit in advocacy. We've had a climate position since 2007, recently revised and updated, and you can look at it on our website. But the portrayal of Rio Tinto's coverage is one of fairly rapid transformation, particularly of late. And there's a graphic that I use to display this. The graphic has two lines on it. Each line represents the share of all greenhouse gas emissions. The blue line, or darker line, in the graph is share of global emissions. So all the CO2 combustion-related emissions globally, and is showing what percentage of them are included in market-based schemes. And you see we started out with the EU, didn't really have much progress from 2005 until 2012. You had Alberta's baseline credit scheme, British Columbia's carbon tax, New Zealand. Essentially, we were right at 15% or 14% for quite a while. Has been increasing of late, and with the inclusion of Australia, Alberta, California, Quebec, South Africa, we think is going to put together a carbon tax proposal, and the 7 provinces and cities in China, which will be a significant, they're significant emitters of CO2, even just those parts. We're getting close to 25% coverage globally of greenhouse gases. And Rio Tinto, as you can tell from the graph, is significantly impacted by the inclusion of Australia. Global coverage hardly took a blip at all, but we have a lot of emissions in Australia. So that put us over 50%, including California and Quebec, puts us close to 75%. If South Africa goes forward, we're more than 75%. We actually don't have any emissions in China, but China is always something that we watch very closely, not just because they're our biggest customer, which they are, but they're also our biggest competitor in commodities such as inputs that go into steel, also copper, also aluminum. They're the biggest aluminum producer in the world. So once those emissions in China are covered under market-based systems, that's eventually likely going to be the threshold by which global commodities will begin to be able to pass through their own compliance costs. Conceivably, when the largest sources of production are covered under a scheme, and if those facilities tend to be at the upper point of the cost curve, let's say third or fourth quartile facilities, meaning they're high cost, if they have significant compliance costs, then essentially everybody else can begin to pass through their costs as well. All of the provisions that are put in, all of the jurisdictions that are depicted in this graph have put in place provisions, particularly for energy-intensive and trade-exposed industry, to address leakage. And I would take a little bit of issue with Simone, who characterized leakage as a fairness issue, and support for energy-intensive and trade-exposed industries as an issue of leveling the playing field. There is a serious environmental consideration to take into account as well, and if not addressed, will work against the very objectives of greenhouse gas regulations. So the reason to do this, certainly from our perspective, is because we won't be able to pass through our costs, and unlike every other participant in the market, they'll be able to pass on their costs to their customers given certain conditions of supply and demand. We're not. And that's not a failure of the markets. It's a failure of the policy to take into account that you're imposing a local regulation on a global commodity market. So once a global commodity market reflects compliance costs, then that's fine. And I don't think it's ever an issue of fairness. It's an issue of environmental efficiency and environmental effectiveness. So I mentioned that the EITE provisions are in place in all of these areas. There's a universal formula that you can use to look at compensation for individual jurisdictions. And all these jurisdictions are putting in place one version or another of this formula. Formula is an equality. On the left-hand side of the equal sign, you have tons of free allowances. Now, if it's a carbon tax, you have the exact same sort of formula. It's usually in the form of a tax threshold. So this is the formula that would give you the tax threshold above which you would have to pay for every ton of emissions, and below which you would essentially not have to pay the tax. So getting a free allowance is essentially the same as not having to pay below a certain level of emissions. Very similar to like a baselining credit scheme as Alberta has. So on the far right-hand side of the equality, you have production. Most jurisdictions have put in place a form of output-based rebates, similar to what Waxman-Markey considered, multiplied by a support rate, which is a percentage. So those numbers are important to be looking at. Then inside the brackets, and also proportional to production and the support rate, are usually benchmarks. The first benchmark, the blue box just off by itself, is a benchmark that exists at the sectoral level for direct emissions, Scope 1 emissions, and the sector could be aluminum smelters, it could be chemical plants, it could be refineries, or whatever. Those are the direct emissions. You also have benchmarks for indirect or Scope 2 emissions, and those are usually composed of two different terms. One, which I've labeled B here, is the carbon intensity of the electricity, either on average or on the margin. That is to say, if it's a competitive market, essentially what you're seeing in the power price is the carbon footprint of the marginal supplier in that power market. So you would have a benchmark associated with that. And then you would, and if it was a regulated cost of service, it would be the average carbon intensity of electricity. And then you have a benchmark of consumption, of electricity per ton of final product. So you can convince yourself at least that the terms cancel each other out, and you've got tons on the left-hand side. All of the jurisdictions are essentially following this formula. They just have different values for each of the individual terms. So what I've done on the next slide is show for the EU, New Zealand, California, Australia, and Quebec what the values of A, B, C, D, and E are. And just to throw out the EU and California examples, slightly different on the benchmark for direct emissions. This benchmark at the sectoral level, the EU is the average of the top 10% of the sector. That's what you get for in terms of free allowance, whereas California is at the sector average. Depending on the distribution of facilities within the sector, there could be a difference there. Production, so going to D and E, the points outside the bracket, their production in the EU, it's output, but it's actually historical output. So what you're doing in any particular period is not going to affect how many allowances you get. It's frozen in the past. The California scheme, on the other hand, they actually have two different schemes. There are two different ways to get free allowances. One is an output-based average of the previous 3 years, and the other one is called a thermal benchmark. Initial rate, 100% for the most trade-exposed regions. California is reducing commensurate with the level of the cap. California, another difference in California and the EU, California gives no compensation for indirect emissions from facilities. The EU gives up to, these are guidelines that Simone mentioned, up to 85% of the weighted regional average of emissions if the power source is fossil per megawatt hour. So a slight difference there. There's a subsequent table that goes through some other aspects of the scheme. I won't really go through it here, but it does include the Alberta, BC, and South Africa schemes, and some of the provisions that I think are most relevant. The conclusions that I would offer are that California and the EU provisions are roughly equivalent. There's certainly differences in the compensation for indirects. Usually we would be arguing strongly that indirects need to be compensated as well. As it turns out, we generate our own power in California, and all of our emissions associated with steam generation and power count as Scope 1 or direct emissions. So we haven't been as vocal about it as we would be if, let's say, Australia had tried to do it this way. And I'd just highlight that could be problematic for California going forward with respect to their competitiveness provisions. Continues to be an important issue of how you deal with trade exposure, and similar methods are being used regardless of what the system is. I think any system, cap, trade, tax, doesn't really matter. You can address this particular leakage issue and not stand in the way of the policy going forward. There was a comment about the EITE provisions post-2020. I would assert that every single provision of cap-and-trade schemes in the EU, California, Quebec, Australia, there's a huge amount of uncertainty about what's happening post-2020. And it is really kind of the entirety of those that give companies like ours, and I'm sure others that have a compliance responsibility, a lot of angst in terms of what exactly is going to happen after 2020, and at what point is it going to affect the performance of the carbon markets. So with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jeff. That was really interesting. And I think we're getting a lot of questions coming in, and I just want to remind the folks on the line that normally we take the questions throughout the presentation, and then we'll open up for a Q&A once we finish all the presentations. So we'll just hold all those to the end. So moving along, we have our next speaker is Alex Hanafi from the Environmental Defense Fund. He's their lead attorney on climate change. And coincidentally, they have a report coming out, was released yesterday on the EU emissions trading system, results and lessons learned. So it really coincided quite well with this webinar. And so they're going to talk about the results and some of the lessons for California. So Alex, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks very much, Scott, and appreciate the chance to be able to talk a little bit about the report, and then I'll actually split my time with my colleague Derek Walker, who will talk about the lessons that California has taken from the EU program and what they've done to design their program to take those lessons into account. So I'll be very, very brief here, and what I'll try to do is essentially summarize some of the key points from the report that Scott mentioned that we released yesterday. And before I do that, I just quickly start with a little bit of context just to let people know about EDF and our work on the EU ETS. EDF is a non-profit, non-partisan, non-governmental organization. We have about 700,000 members in the U.S. And we've been closely following the work on the EU ETS because we think it's potentially, as Simone mentioned, a potential model for how others around the world might implement programs to reduce carbon emissions. It's the world's first and largest program to limit carbon pollution, and it's important both because of its size and scope, but also because of its timing, because it is the world's first multinational cap-and-trade system, and it's something that a lot of other jurisdictions are looking to for lessons. So the particular reason why we think it's important is that with international climate treaty negotiations so far unable to deliver the emissions cuts needed to avert what scientists tell us will be dangerous climate change, successful initiatives to reduce global warming pollution are ever more important. And the 30 countries that are participating in the EU ETS account for about 20% of global gross domestic product and about 17% of world energy-related CO2 emissions. So on its own, it's also a significant contributor to efforts to reduce emissions around the globe. So the specific questions we tried to answer in our research in the report that we released yesterday revolved around three critical areas. The first one is the question of, is the EU ETS actually reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Europe above and beyond the effects of the global recession? The second question was, is the EU ETS efficiently meeting its goals, given the media attention to issues like the over-allocation of emissions allowances in Phase 1, price volatility that's been seen particularly in Phase 1, windfall profits, and questions about the integrity of international carbon offsets under the UN-approved CDM, Clean Development Mechanism. And the third question was, has the EU ETS addressed its security vulnerabilities, and did these vulnerabilities affect the system's emissions reductions? So I'll very briefly go through the 6 key results and findings that came out of our research into these 3 questions. And there's a lot of slides that come after this that go into each of these results in more depth. But I think what I'll do is in the interest of time, I'll just briefly summarize these results and then skip probably to the last slide on key takeaways, and then shift it over to Derek so he can pick up on some of these in the California context. So the first key result we found was that the EU ETS has indeed achieved significant emissions reductions at low cost, even during periods of economic growth in Europe. And so what this means is that there have been reductions caused by the EU ETS that are above and beyond the contractive effects from the recession, which would normally be expected to reduce emissions in any case. So the question then becomes, well, how much has it reduced emissions? And from the research that we've found, it seems that the best estimates are that Phase 1 reduced emissions between about 2 to 5% below what they would have been without the EU ETS. And it's important to keep in mind that in Phase 1, that was before the recession and while the EU economy was growing. And overall, even including phase 2, when the recession hit, estimates indicate that the ETS itself was responsible for reductions of more than 480 million tons of CO2, which, for comparison, is more than the entire 2009 CO2 emissions of Mexico or Australia. So the key first lesson was that it's working. The second key lesson from the EU ETS has to do with the allocation, lessons around the allocation of allowances and how those allowances are distributed and how they're regulated over trading periods. So this actually is 2 slides ahead. Maybe we could just talk about this briefly. And this one, the lessons that we found here and the results we found essentially are that the emissions caps, when they were set in phase 1, they were based on estimates of projected emissions from regulated entities under the cap. And that's a problem. And it's a problem because if they're based on estimated emissions, there's an incentive to overestimate your emissions. And that's a natural incentive. And that was exactly what happened in the EU ETS in the first phase, is that too many emissions allowances were granted. And as a result, as shown on the graph here, the price for phase 1 emissions allowances collapsed. But the other, so the key lesson here is that emissions caps and resulting allowance allocation should be based on measured and verified historical emissions rather than on projected emissions. The other key lesson is something that comes from looking at the second line on that graph, which is that phase 2 allowances still retain their value even during the price volatility that was experienced in phase 1. And that's because they were bankable. Phase 2 allowances were bankable, but phase 1 allowances were not. So the lesson that comes away from that is that allowing banking of allowances between trading periods provides that long-term policy environment that's needed for actors to make the investments in emissions reductions now, which is precisely what we want, is to make those emissions reductions now when we need them. So I'll skip ahead then to the final couple of recommendations, which essentially, and Simone has covered this a little bit on the issues of tax fraud and theft of allowances, but the key point here is that this is not necessarily unique. What the EU saw is not necessarily unique to the emissions trading system, of course. All sorts of financial instruments need effective governance and regulatory bodies, as well as preventive electronic security systems. And the EU has made some changes to try to adapt to those needs and the cyber attacks that it experienced in recent years. So the final recommendation that comes out of the report, and this is captured in an appendix to the report, is about how companies and regulated entities under cap-and-trade systems respond creatively to seek out those least cost solutions that are the entire goal of a cap-and-trade system, reducing emissions at the lowest cost. And we highlight a number of those in the report in an appendix, and for more detail, you can certainly go and see those and encourage you to look at those. So let me just wrap up very briefly and then hand this over to Derek, some key takeaways from the report and what we learned about the EU ETS system. The first is that this is a system that's maturing over time. And as anything that's the first of its kind in the world, there are going to be inevitable growing pains. And the EU experienced those growing pains. But despite that, the key finding is that the cap-and-trade system is working. It is reducing emissions, and it's achieving those emissions at relatively low cost. By the estimates we've seen, approximately 0.01% of GDP, at least in these early phases. Now, if that continues in future phases, if that low cost continues, which is something we'll be watching, it wouldn't necessarily be unsurprising, considering the history of other cap-and-trade programs, including RGGI, including the US SO2 trading program, which the EU ETS was modeled on. In each of these systems, the predicted costs of compliance with the cap-and-trade policy have been much higher than the actual costs that are seen when these programs go into effect. So each of them has typically achieved their results much faster and much cheaper than was initially predicted. And it seems that the EU ETS is no different in that regard. The other key takeaway from this report, I think, is that there's good news for other countries and states that are looking to implement their own cap-and-trade systems. And there's a whole host of them that are doing this. There are 18 jurisdictions that are currently implementing or developing carbon trading systems located on 5 different continents. And this is a big group of countries, including China, including South Korea, including Australia, of course. These countries account for about 42% of global emissions. So it's not a small group of countries that are taking action and are looking for how to do this properly. And EDF is issuing joint reports soon with IETA that will present case studies of these 18 different jurisdictions. So the final point I'll just make here is that the EU ETS experience, I think, underscores the usefulness of learning or pilot periods, as it had in the first phase, with ample opportunities for review and adjustment. But for media coverage and for public perception, unfortunately, the challenges that those pilot periods are meant to address, for example, the phase 1 price volatility and collapse, allocation and cap setting procedures, et cetera, in a complex multinational system, those tend to be what lingers in everyone's minds, which I think is really a communication challenge more than anything else. So in my mind, that underscores the importance of setting expectations realistically from the outset for cap-and-trade programs. There may be issues in the beginning. In fact, there will likely be issues in the beginning, and that's normal. But these systems do work to reduce emissions, and they do it at low cost. So the other good news is that those responsible for designing California's cap-and-trade system have been paying attention to the challenges faced by their EU counterparts, and they've made some proactive adjustments to California's system that will make implementation smoother for California participants. And Derek will talk about that more shortly. So at that point, I'll hand it over to Derek.
Thanks, Alex. This is Derek Walker at EDF, and I am certain that most of you have heard a lot of great information for the last 45 minutes, so I will try to be brief so we can get a couple questions in before the end of the time. California would be entirely remiss if we did not demonstrate that we had an awareness of and had demonstrated an adaptation to some of these lessons that have been described by Alex. California has had a long history, of course, of implementing policies that not only achieve environmental protection but also grow the economy here. And as an advocacy organization, we're not just about environmental protection, we're about environmental protection that also creates sustainability. So as you can see, a sustainable economy. So as you can see by this graph that many of you may already be aware of, California has had a legacy over the last 40 years or so, increasing their per capita GDP while maintaining electricity consumption that is pretty flat. So this legacy, combined with the lessons learned from the EU experience, we think position California very well as we get our program launched with the first auction here in just a few weeks. So the major lessons that have been learned by California and applied into the rulemaking process are first of all, cap setting. You know, the EU in its pilot phase had to rely on emissions estimates that were reported by industry. California has data going back to 2008 that are based on actual measured emissions. And this is really critical not only for California's program but also for other programs that inevitably will, where linkage to California will be discussed. Secondly is the issue of windfall profits. You know, California has a built-in what you might call advantage in the sense that the electricity sector is very closely regulated here. And also just the combination of allowance, auctioning, and free distribution that California has created provides a bit of a deterrent to that same problem occurring in California as it occurred in the early years of the EU. And as we say here, the importance here is to continue monitoring how the program works with respect to the economic impacts, both on business and on consumers as the program rolls out. Important to say, I think, for everyone listening, that though this is, we believe, a very well-designed program at this point, in no way is it sacrosanct, and we're going to be working with many of you on the phone to make sure we're advocating for modifications as the program goes forward. The third area where there's been some lessons learned is on offsets, where, as most of you know, California has taken a process of project protocols, four project protocols that have been approved so far, and in the area of international, though no international credits, of course, have been approved so far for use in the California system, California is intending to only approve credits that come from jurisdictional systems like RED, where there's actually a cap on the entire jurisdiction's that sector in that entire jurisdiction. So we believe that's critical for environmental integrity and also just to ensure that we're maintaining adherence to the stringent guidelines of AB 32. And then finally, on the issue of price stability, of course, I'm thinking back to what Simone started with, talking about how it's important to keep costs under control. We totally agree. The program is not going to survive politically, and it's not going to unlock maximum innovation if there's not price stability, and certainly we want to avoid the spiky ends of the curve. California is going to be carefully monitoring the market as it goes forward for price fluctuations, and we believe that the allowance reserve that was put into place and actually is being discussed a bit today at the CAR board meeting is an important tool for doing this. So I'm going to just cut it there and open it up. Hopefully Scott will go ahead and open it up for questions, so at least we get a few in before the end of the hour.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Derek. I will go ahead and open it up for questions. And first of all, I just want to let everyone know that we are going to be making all these presentations available online. So for your download, I know we put a lot of information into all of those presentations, and it's a lot to digest in just an hour. So those presentations will be made available online, and I'll send the link out to the group in just a few moments. But first, let me take a question. And if you do have a question, feel free to dial it into the question box on the webinar software. I've already got a few that have come in, so I'll go ahead and start with a question for Simone. Do you think the absence of a price floor in the EU ETS has undermined its ability to drive down CO2 emissions?
Oh, it's a very good question. Thank you for that, Alex. I think that the price floor would probably have been set at the wrong level. We were pre-recession. We were probably we would probably have been overtaken by events fairly quickly. And in the context of an EU system where you actually have 27 member states who have to decide on that price floor, I really think they would never have been able to decide on that. So in that sense, I think the price floor by itself is actually really a very difficult political tool to introduce in a European system. If we had had one at the appropriate price level, say for 2 years we had around a carbon price of 15 euros, between 15 and 17 euros. If we had had a minimum price, say around 12 or 13 euros, this might still have been too low in the current context where coal prices are particularly low compared to gas prices in the very reverse situation to the US. And so the fuel switching would actually, the CO2 price required for the fuel switching is actually above the 20 euros a ton. So this 13 euros a ton minimum price floor in a European context would have been a dead weight loss, really, because companies would have had to pay that cost, but it would not have really generated a high incentive to reduce emissions. Back to you, Alex. Alex?
Yeah, hi.
I apologize. I was on mute there. I've got another question coming in, and this one's for Jeff. It's as one of the largest participants in global greenhouse gas reduction schemes, does Rio Tinto have a preference for a tax versus a cap and trade?
I think historically we've always said we prefer cap and trade, in part because I think these EITE provisions work better as free allowances rather than tax exemptions. It just seems more direct. But increasingly I think that these schemes can be implemented either way. The important thing is the design. I think they can all deliver the same environmental benefits, pending the attention to design.
Okay, great. Yeah, and I've got a follow-up question, the same one for EDF, and I'll let Derek and Alex weigh in on whether EDF has a preference for a tax versus cap and trade.
Well, this is Derek. We certainly have a preference, in part because of what we've seen successfully rendered through the EU ETS as well as through the previous trading program for SO2, that a cap and trade program is a preferable system. The important thing there is of course that there's a cap on greenhouse gas emissions, so that there's this environmental certainty of getting down to a volume which protects the planet, and that environmental certainty combined with the flexibility for regulated entities and the past history of success, we think is a winning combination.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think market-based approaches are always, at least in our view, the way forward. Getting into a little bit more programmatic and a question related to California, and this is addressed to the entire panel, on whether complementary policies in California, such as the 33% RPS, the low carbon fuel standard, and energy efficiency measures are cost effective in the short and long term, or whether economy-wide cap and trade would be preferable from a GHG cost effectiveness standpoint. And in the EU, what lesson for California can be drawn from recent concerns that the Energy Efficiency Directive will result in further decreases in the EU allowance prices? So I know that's a lot to digest, but whoever wants to take a first whack can go right ahead.
Well, I'll just jump in. This is Jeff. These complementary measures, there's basically no way they can be as efficient as a market-based system. They will result in GHG reductions. I presume they'll be well designed enough to result in reductions. It will do so at a higher cost than the market would deliver, but there's a certain segment of the population, a certain segment of the political population that wants to hide those costs. They're better off being exposed so they can be minimized. But they will result in reductions, and they will affect the carbon price. They'll bring it down. But it'll be an illusion because that price will pop up somewhere else.
Great. Yeah, and to my knowledge, these complementary measures, at least in California, are all part of the scoping plan to meet the goals set out by AB 32. I don't know if anyone else wants to weigh in on that.
Well, maybe on Europe, from our perspective, of course, the emissions trading scheme and the Energy Efficiency Directive, but also renewable energy targets were all decided at the same time. So in theory, they should all be coordinated, and whatever is reduced in one should not affect the baseline for the ETS system. However, in reality, you do see that an acceleration of renewable implementation through very generous feed-in tariffs does affect the perceptions of what is actually there to be reduced in the ETS. And that's, of course, because you have the power sector covered under the ETS, and anything that is driving decarbonization of the power sector will reduce the demand of the power sector for emission allowances under the EU ETS and drive down the price. So there is this kind of negative effect on the EU ETS and the incentive that the EU ETS can give in driving emission reductions, making it more expensive overall to reduce these emissions. At the same time, you also have the problem that some of the technologies that are out there will probably not be incentivized by the carbon price for some time to come, and the best example is carbon capture and storage. So you do need some additional measures to incentivize these technologies, but they don't necessarily have to be affecting the carbon price. They can be taken outside the system. And in the EU, we actually have the possibility to auction a certain amount of allowances to generate revenue for a certain amount of pilot projects in this area, which is called the NER 300. Just because of the carbon price going down in the last year, so this revenue raising effort has been a lot less successful than initially expected, so we don't have the money to finance all of these pilot projects. But this is an idea where you can actually use the ETS system to generate revenue for making not yet commercial technology advance and become closer to commercialization.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. Sometimes I get the question here at the reserve of why we don't have a protocol for carbon capture and storage, and the answer I always give is that those a project like that is multi-million-dollar, very capital intensive, and a dollar or two credit, we don't really feel like it would give that carbon finance would make those projects more or less feasible. But I like the idea of obviously money coming from the auction is subject of very much interest and debate. So maybe some of that will be directed towards some of those emerging technology. So I think
I would just add that the main reason not to have offsets for carbon capture and storage is because power generation is under the cap. Likewise, reductions that are brought about through incentives for certain types of technology over another will distort the market. If the question is efficiency, then the answer is really no. Of course, the question is never just about efficiency; it's about equity as well. So certain technologies over others they have to be fair game. Just don't fool yourself into thinking you're improving efficiency by distorting the investment incentives.
Okay, great. So I think I'll go ahead and move to end the webinar. I want to just make a note that the presentations will be made available online. I sent out the link to the entire audience, and I want to take the moment to thank all of our guest speakers that participated this morning. Very fascinating and interesting presentations. And thanks to the audience. Apologies for the technical difficulties getting started, but we had some great questions, and thank everyone for taking part. So with that, I will go ahead and end the webinar. So thanks, everyone.